February 14, 1873, southwestern Nebraska Territory, 3 mi west of what would eventually become the town of Macook. The temperature sat at 17 below zero with a wind that could strip the hide off a mule. 16-year-old Ingrid Lindstrom pressed her back against the earthen wall she'd carved into the south-facing hillside, watching her breath crystallize in the air outside while the space behind her held steady at 68. She'd been living in this hole in the ground for 43 days. The Methodist minister's wife, who turned her out, had given her $11 in coin and a canvas tarp. Ingrid had spent $9.75 on tools and materials that now kept her alive. The girl ran her calloused hand along the wall, packed earth, 18 in thick, layered with dried prairie grass she'd woven into mats. Above that sod blocks she'd cut herself stacked in a dome that shed water and held heat. The design wasn't hers originally. She'd seen something like it in a book about Norse settlements in Iceland, back when her father was still alive, and books were things they owned, but she'd adapted it, refined it, made it work with what the Nebraska prairie gave her. 300 yards downhill, smoke rose from the chimney of the Holloway homestead. She could see Martha Holloway hanging laundry that would freeze stiff before it dried. The Holloway's cabin, built with lumber hauled 60 miles from the nearest sawmill, leaked heat through every gap in the planking. Ingrid newbie cows she'd helped those gaps with mud and prairie grass last November before Martha's husband, James, had forbidden her from their property. Unnatural, he'd called her. A girl living alone like some kind of animal. James Holloway stood 6'2" and had served with the 5th Iowa Infantry. He'd built 3 successful homesteads in his lifetime and considered himself an authority on frontier survival. When he heard what Ingrid was planning, he'd ridden up to her hill with specific objections. You can't dig deep enough without timber. Shoring, he'd said, sitting his horse like he was addressing troops. The whole thing will collapse first heavy snow, and even if it don't, you'll freeze solid soon as winter sets in proper. Earth don't hold heat worth a damn, Ingrid hadn't argued. She just thanked him for his concern and gone back to digging. Now, 43 days into what the old-timers were calling the worst winter since '56, Ingrid's underground shelter held at 68 while James Holloway burned through his winter wood supply at twice the expected rate. She knew because she'd helped him calculate that supply back when he still spoke to her. The girl had arrived in Red Willow County in July of 1872 with her father, Magnus Lindstrom, a Norwegian immigrant who'd filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of prairie 8 miles from the nearest neighbor. They'd built a dugout together that first summer, father and daughter working side by side. Magnus had taught her to read land like some men read books, where to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds, how to judge soil quality by the plants that grew wild, which grasses made the strongest building material, and which would rot inside a season. Then in October, Magnus had taken sick fever that started mild and turned vicious inside 48 hours. By the time Ingrid had walked to the Holloway place and Jamish had written for the doctor in Culbertson, Magnus Lindstrom was past saving. Typhoid, the doctor said, probably from the well Magnus had dug too close to where they'd buried waste. The doctor's fee took for of their $11. The burial took another $2. Martha Holloway had taken Ingrid in, fed her, let her sleep in their loft, tried to be kind. But Martha had 4 children of her own, and another on the way, and when Ingrid had refused James Holloway's attempt to arrange her marriage to his cousin in Iowa, the Christian charity had warned then, "You can't stay here acting like you got choices," Martha had said, her voice gentle but final. This ain't the world for that. So Ingrid had left, not back to Norway, where she had no family, not to Iowa to marry a man she'd never met. She'd walked 3 miles west of unclaimed land and started digging. If you're watching this because you're tired of half-baked survival stories and want to see how people actually lived through impossible situations with nothing but knowledge and determination, hit that subscribe button. We're documenting techniques that kept people alive when there was no one coming to help, and no safety net if they failed. This is the real thing. The skeptics had multiplied once word spread. James Holloway brought reinforcements. First came Wilhelm Schneider, a German immigrant who'd successfully farmed 40 acres of Kansas hardpan before moving north. Wilhelm was 53, methodical, and spoke 5 languages. He'd studied engineering in Frankfurt before political trouble sent him west. He'd examined Ingrid's work with the precision of a surveyor. The heat retention principle is sound, he admitted. Walking the perimeter of her excavation, Earth has thermal mass, yes. But your insulation layer is insufficient. You need minimum to feet off barrier material between living space and frozen ground. You have perhaps 14 in of grass mat. Also, your ventilation. Where is your ventilation? You'll suffocate or die from your own fire smoke. Ingrid had shown him the 2 foreign channels she'd dug at opposing angles, lined with hollow reeds she'd harvested from the creek bed and sealed with clay. One brought fresh air in near the floor. One vented smoke and stale air near the ceiling. The differential in temperature would create draw. She explained she'd read about it in a book about PBLO structures. In New Mexico, Wilhelm had frowned. In theory, yes. In practice, with these materials, at these temperatures, I think you die. Then came Samuel and Ruth Washington, a black couple who'd homesteaded for miles north after walking from Missouri with their 3 children. Samuel had been born enslaved, had learned blacksmithing in captivity, and had more practical knowledge in his hands than most men acquired into lifetimes. He'd offered to help Ingrid build a proper cabin. I appreciate what you're trying to do, Samuel had said, but pride ain't worth freezing over. We got timber. We can raise you a cabin in 3 days, weatherproof it in 5. This hole you're digging, it might work for summer cool, but come real winter, you need walls and a roof and a proper stove. Ingrid had shown him her calculations. The shelter was 8 feet deep at the center, domed to distribute weight. The Earth's temperature at 8 feet stayed constant year-round, somewhere between 55 and 60 regardless of surface conditions. Her grass mat insulation and sod layers didn't need to create heat. They just needed to prevent the interior warmth from escaping. Her body heat, plus 1 small fire burning for hours per day, would maintain livable temperature. Samuel had listened, then shaken his head. Math is math. Reality is different. First blizzard hits, you'll see. The last skeptic was Father Patrick Brennan, the Irish priest who rode a circuit between 5 settlements, holding mass in whatever structure would accommodate him. Father Brennan was 38, educated in Dublin, and carried a burden of authority that sat heavy on his narrow shoulders. He'd heard about Ingrid from Martha Holloway, and had come to convince her to accept placement with a Catholic family in Omaha. Child, he'd said, and his voice held genuine concern. This isn't about capability, it's about what's proper. A girl your age living alone on open prairie, it invites talk, it invites danger. Men will assume things, the weather will kill you, and if it doesn't, your reputation will. Ingrid had met his eyes. Father, my reputation died with my father. I'm building what it need to survive. That's the only proper thing there is. Father Brennan had blessed her anyway, though he looked skeptical doing it. The first blizzard had hit November 28th, 3 days after Ingrid moved into her shelter. The temperature dropped to 23 below. Wind screamed across the prairie at 40 miles per hour, driving snow so thick it was like living inside a cloud. The storm lasted 31 hours. Ingrid had sealed her entrance with a double layer of canvas and sod blocks, leaving just the ventilation channels open. She'd lit a small fire using buffalo chips she'd gathered and dried, fuel that burned slow and hot. The shelter's temperature had dropped to 64 during the storm's peak, then climbed back to 67 once she'd a dead fuel. Outside, the world had disappeared into white fury. Inside, Ingrid had sat trapped in the wool blanket her father had brought from Norway, reading by firelight from the one book she owned, a water-damaged copy of Robinson Crusoe she'd found abandoned in a wagon rut. The parallel wasn't lost on her. When storm broke, she'd emerged to find drifts 10 feet high against the south sides of every rise. The temperature was 31. She'd walked to the Holloway place to make sure they'd survived. James Holloway had burned through 8 days worth of firewood. In 31 hours, his cabin, for all its proper construction and good lumber, had leaked heat through every joint and gap. Ice had formed on the inside of the walls. Martha's children had huddled together in one bed, buried under every blanket they owned. The family was fine but shaken, and the winter had barely started. Jamashot stared at Ingrid like she was some kind of ghost. "How'd you fare?" he'd asked, his voice carrying an edge that might have been concern or might have been something else. "Warm enough," she'd said, "came to see if you needed anything." He needed firewood. She'd helped him split today's worth before heading back to her hill. By mid-December, word had spread. The strange Norwegian girl living in a hole in the ground was surviving conditions that were testing Gavin experienced homesteaders. Curiosity began replacing judgment. First came Wilhelm Schneider, hat literally in hand, asking if he might examine her shelter's interior. Ingrid had shown him. The entrance tunnel sloped down at a 15 angle, 42 in wide, designed to wrap cold air. The main chamber measured 12 feet in diameter with a 7 feet ceiling at dome's peak. The walls were triple-layered packed earth-woven grass mottes providing 14 in of insulation. Then an interior finish of sod blocks chinkaked with clay. The floor was hard-packed earth covered with woven reed mats. A small fire pit occupied the center lined with river stones and vented through one of the reed channels. Storage alcove carved into the walls held her supplies: dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, a sack of potatoes buried in sand to prevent freezing. A water barrel sat near the entrance where temperature stayed coolest. Her bedding occupied a raised platform in the back, keeping her off the cold floor. Wilhelm had produced a thermometer, a luxury item he'd carried from Germany, 68°F, exactly as Ingrid had claimed. Outside temperature at that moment was -4. "Mein Gott," Wilhelm had whispered. "Thermal mass principle. It actually works at scale." He'd spent 3 hours examining every detail. The angle of the dome for structural integrity, the layered insulation approach, the ventilation system that somehow pulled fresh air in without bleeding heat, the strategic placement of the fire pit to create convection currents that distributed warmth evenly. "This is no accident," Wilhelm had said finally. "This is engineering. Where did you learn this?" Ingrid had shrugged. "Books, observation. My father taught me to think about how things work, not just accept how they've always been done." Wilhelm had left, but returned 3 days later with Samuel Washington and a proposal. Would Ingrid be willing to share her design? Samuel's family was struggling. In their cabin, the children were getting sick from the cold. Could she help them build a similar shelter? Something supplemental, maybe for sleeping quarters? Before you click away to watch something else, hit that like button if you want to see more stories about people who solved real problems with actual knowledge instead of just throwing money at them. These techniquested lives, they're worth remembering. By January, Ingrid had helped 3 families build earth structures based on her design, not full underground shelters. Most people weren't ready to live in what they still thought of as a hole in the ground, but hybrid buildings that used Earth's thermal mass for heating and cooling. Samuel Washington's family built a sleeping room dug 4 feet into a hillside with a sod roof and stone wall facing south. The structure stayed at 58 with no fire at all. The children stopped coughing within a week. The Schneider family built a root cellar that doubled as a winter refuge 8 by 10 feet 6 feet deep. With Wilhelm's engineering precision applied to Ingrid's principles, they could sleep there during the worst storms and cut their wood consumption by 60%. Father Brennan requested help building a storm shelter near his primary chapel in Karlbertsen. "I may have misjudged you," he'd said to Ingrid. "Pride keeps men from learning. I'm trying to be less proud." The work gave Ingrid something she hadn't expected: community, not the charity-based relationship she'd had before, where she was the orphan to be pied, the problem to be solved. This was exchange. She had knowledge. They had resources. Together, they improved everyone's chances. James Holloway was the last holdout. He'd watched from a distance as his neighbors adopted techniques from a 16-year-old girl he dismissed as foolish. His pride kept him burning through firewood at an unsustainable rate. while his family shivered and his children grew thin from the energy their bodies spent trying to stay warm. It was Martha who finally broke through. On January 19, 1874, with temperatures at -27 and their wood supply down to 9 days remaining, Martha had walked to Ingrid's shelter and asked for help. Not for herself, for children. Ingrid had come. James hadn't spoken to her, but he hadn't refused her entry either. She'd spent 3 days at the Holloway place, teaching them techniques that didn't require building their entire cabin. They'd banked earth against the north and west walls, creating a thermal buffer. They'd hung wool blankets inside, creating a smaller, easier to heat space within the larger structure. They'd sealed gaps with a mixture of clay, grass, and animal fat that hardened in the cold and actually expanded slightly, creating better seal than mud alone. Most importantly, Ingrid had shown them how to build a small underground sleeping chamber adjacent to the cabin, connected by a short tunnel, 8 by 8 feet, 5 trillion deep, just enough for the family to sleep in during the worst cold. The earth wouldn't warm them by itself, but it would prevent the deadly heat loss that happened in an above-ground structure. James had worked alongside her, saying nothing. On the third day, as they finished packing the last sod block, he'd finally spoken. "I was wrong about you. I thought I knew everything worth knowing about surviving out here. Turns out I just knew what I'd been taught." Ingrid had nodded. Knowledge isn't knowing things. It's being willing to learn new things when the old things stop working. The winter of 1873-1874 killed 11 people in Red Willow County. Exposure, cold, related illness, accidents caused by desperate attempts to find or conserve fuel. But the families who'd adopted Ingrid's earth-burning techniques, 7 in total by February, all survived. Their fuel consumption ran 40 to 65% lower than traditional cabins. Their illness rates dropped. Their children stayed healthier. The crisis that proved the design's worth came February 23rd. A blizzard that old-timers still talk about 5 decades later. The temperature hit -41, cold enough to freeze kerosene, cold enough to kill in minutes. The storm lasted 56 hours without break. Ingrid's shelter held at 66. She'd burned through 12 buffalo chips total, less fuel than most families burned in 6 hours. The Washington survived in their hybrid structure, though Samuel had to venture out twice to bring in snow to melt for water. The Schnatter stayed in their engineered shelter and didn't leave until the storm passed. Father Brennan's storm shelter near Culbertson saved 14 people who'd been caught traveling when the blizzard hit. The structure held heat from 17 bodies with no fire at all, staying just above 45 through the worst of it. The Howeys had retreated to their underground sleeping chamber. James had kept a small fire burning, feeding it carefully rationed wood. They'd emerged alive, but shaken. Without that chamber, Martha said later, they wouldn't have made it. The children would have frozen in their beds. After the storm, something shifted. Ingrid wasn't the strange girl living like an animal anymore. She was the Norwegian engineer who'd brought old world knowledge to new world problems. Visitors started coming to examine her shelter, take measurements, ask questions. A surveyor from the county office measured the temperature differential 14 times across various weather conditions. The underground shelter consistently maintained 65 to 69 F when outside temperatures ranged from 37 to +12. No shelter type in the county could match that stability. A doctor from McCook examined the health records of families using earth structures versus traditional cabins. Respiratory illness rates ran 43% lower in the earth homes. Cold-related injuries were virtually non-existent. A traveling journalist from Omaha wrote about the girl who lives underground for the Nebraska Advertiser. The article brought more visitors, more questions, more people wanting to learn. Wilhelm Schneider began documenting Ingrid's design in precise engineering drawings. He'd measured every angle, every dimension, calculated load-bearing capacities and insulation values. This should be taught, he told her. This should be standard knowledge for frontier settlement. Samuel Washington had a different perspective. Your daddy would be proud, he'd said. He taught you to think. You took what you learned and made it better. That's what knowledge is supposed to do, grow and adapt. The question everyone asked was how she'd known it would work. How had a 16-year-old girl with $11 designed something that outperformed structures built by experienced men with 10 times the resources? Ingrid's answer was always the same. I didn't know it would work. I knew it might work based on principles I'd learned. So, I tested it. When it worked, I refined it. When something didn't work, I changed it. That's not genius. That's just being willing to try, but there was more to it than that. Ingrid had combined knowledge from multiple sources: Norse turf houses, PBLO earth structures, root cellar principles, Icelandic geothermal concepts, and adapted them to prairie conditions. She'd taken techniques developed in different climates, different eras, different cultures, and synthesized them into something new. Facade cutting technique came from watching homesteaders build houses. The insulation layering came from her father's description of Norwegian farms. The ventilation system borrowed from PBLO designs she'd read about. The dome structure reflected principles she'd seen in books about ancient architecture. It was integration, not invention. By spring of 1874, Ingrid had helped design 11 earth structures across 3 counties. Some were full underground shelters like hers. Others were hybrid designs, combining traditional construction with earth banking and thermal mass principles. Each was customized to its location, soil type, water table depth, prevailing wind direction. Available materials. Theka's savings were staggering. Ingrid's shelter had cost $9.75 in materials: a pickaxe, a shovel, a canvas tarp, some rope, and nails for door frame. A traditional homestead cabin ran $60 to $120 in lumber alone, not counting labor and hardware. Earth structures could be built for $15 to $35 depending on size and complexity. The performance advantage was equally dramatic. Traditional cabins required 3 to 5 cords of wood per winter. For heating, earth structures needed 1 cord or less in a region where wood was scarce and had to be hauled from distant sources. That difference meant the difference between sustainable settlement and constant fuel crisis. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. In April 1874, a delegation from the Department of the Interior visited Red Willow County. As part of a survey on homestead success rates, they'd heard reports about unusual structures and wanted to investigate whether they represented viable solutions for frontier settlement. The surveyors spent 3 days examining earth-burn-made homes and interviewing families. They measured temperatures, calculated fuel consumption, assessed structural integrity, interviewed residents about health and comfort. Their report, filed with the department in June 1874, concluded that earth-burned construction showed marked advantages in thermal performance, fuel efficiency, and cost-effectiveness compared to traditional frame construction in prairie environs. The report recommended that the department include earthing techniques in official homesteading guidance. It specifically cited the work of Miss I. Lindstrom of Red Willow County, Nebraska, as demonstrating practical application of thermal mass principles at minimal cost using locally available materials. Ingrid was 17 years old. She never saw herself as remarkable. When people praised her, she'd deflect. I just did what was necessary, she'd say. Anyone would have done the same, but that wasn't true. Most people would have accepted charity or married the cousin in Iowa or frozen to death trying to maintain respectability. Ingrid had chosen a different path, that her path, the uncertain path, the path that required her to trust knowledge over convention. Father Brennan had perhaps the most interesting observation. I came here to save you, he told her that spring. Turns out you were saving yourself all along. I confused propriety with morality. You understood that survival is its own morality. James Holloway's transformation was quieter, but no less significant. He'd stopped talking about what was proper or natural. Instead, he'd started asking questions. How did you calculate the load-bearing capacity? What made Yao choose that angle for the dome? Could the design work in different soil types? "I thought experience made me wise," admitted to Ingrid. "But experience without willingness to learn just makes you stuck." By autumn of 1874, Ingrid had saved enough money from consultation work to file her own homestead claim. She built a full-sized earth-sheltered home on her 160 acres, incorporating everything she'd learned. The structure featured 3 rooms, all underground, with a southern exposure bringing in natural light, root cellar storage, rainwater collection system, ventilation channels based on her original design, but refined through iteration. The cost $38. For materials she couldn't harvest or make herself. The performance year-round temperatures between 62 and 71 regardless of external conditions. Annual heating fuel requirement, 3/4 of 1 quart of wood. She proved out her claim, living there through 5 more winters. Her health remained excellent. Her fuel costs stayed minimal, and slowly, grudgingly, the wider community accepted that sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected sources, and sometimes survival requires throwing out old assumptions. If you believe in preserving real knowledge from real people who solved real problems, subscribe to this channel. We're documenting techniques that worked when everything depended on them working. That knowledge is worth keeping alive. Modern soil scientists have validated Ingrid's intuitive understanding of thermal mass. Earth at 8 ft depth maintains relatively constant temperature year-round, typically 55 to 65 F depending on latitude, with proper insulation preventing heat exchange with surface conditions. That stable base temperature provides enormous energy advantage. Current earth-sheltered housing research shows fuel savings of 40 to 85% compared to conventional country, exactly matching the results Ingrid achieved in 1873. The principles haven't changed. The physics are identical. We've just forgotten that people figured this out 150 years ago using hand tools and observation. Underground structures built by the ancestral clones in Mesa Verde, Colorado maintained stable temperatures using these same principles 600 years before Ingrid. Norse turf houses in Iceland employed earth banking for thermal performance dating back to the 9th century. Chinese Yang cave dwellings, some still occupied today, have provided stable shelter for 4,000 years using Earth's thermal mass. Ingrid didn't invent anything new. She recognized patterns across cultures and time periods, understood the underlying principles, and applied them to remediate crisis. That's how traditional knowledge survives. Through adaptation, not preservation. The shelter itself stood for 43 years. Ingrid sold that property in 1896 when she moved to Culbertson to live with her grown daughter. The new owner used the structure as a root cellar and workshop. It was finally demolished in 1916 when the land was consolidated into a larger farm. But the design principles spread. By 1880, earth-bermed construction had become common in western Nebraska, southern Dakota Territory, and eastern Colorado. Homesteaders called them Norwegian dugouts or Lindstrom houses, though Ingrid never claimed ownership of the concept. She married Samuel and Ruth Washington's eldest son, Thomas. In 1879, they raised 4 children in earth-sheltered homes. Thomas built using techniques his mother-in-law had pioneered. Thomas became known as one of the best builders in the region, famous for structures that required minimal heating and stayed comfortable year-round. Ingrid died in 1941 at age 84. Her obituary in the McCook Gazette mentioned she'd been one of the early pioneers, whose innovative building techniques helped settlers survive harsh frontier conditions. It didn't mention she'd been 16 when she developed those techniques, or that she'd been thrown out with $11 and no prospects. Those details weren't considered relevant, but they were the most relevant details of all, because the story isn't really about an underground shelter. It's about what happens when you strip away everything: family, security, conventional support, and discover that knowledge is the only resource that can't be taken from you. Ingrid could have accepted charity. She could have married the cousin. She could have given up and died that first winter instead. She'd asked herself a different question: what do I know, and how can I apply it to survive? The answer was buried in books she'd read, techniques her father had taught her, observations she'd made, and principles that crossed cultures and continents. The answer was in understanding that Earth doesn't care about convention or propriety, or what people think is proper for a 16-year-old girl. Earth follows physics, and physics doesn't discriminate. Wilhelm Schneider had written in his engineering notes, Miss Lindstam's achievement demonstrates that formal education is less valuable than the ability to synthesize knowledge from multiple sources and apply first principles to novel problems. She is proof that wisdom emerges from observation, adaptation, and courage to test assumptions. James Holloway, in a letter to his cousin and I were written in 1875, was more direct. I was wrong about the girl, dead wrong. She saved my family's lives by knowing things I didn't know and being willing to do things I thought were beneath dignity. Turns out dignity means nothing when you're freezing to death. I learned more from a 16-year-old in one winter than I learned in 20 years of homesteading. Pride costs more than it's worth. Theleson has nothing to do with building underground shelters. The lesson is about the nature of knowledge itself. Real knowledge isn't static. It doesn't respect authority or tradition. It doesn't care if you're 16 or 60, male or female, educated or self-taught. It only cares whether you can recognize true principles, adapt them to current conditions, and have the courage to test them when your life depends on getting it right. Inger had that courage. At 16, thrown out with $11, facing a Nebraska winter that killed experienced settlers, she trusted knowledge over convention. She combined techniquests from different cultures and time periods. She tested assumptions through direct experiment. She'd refined her approach based on results. And she'd survived, not just survived, thrived. And in thriving, she'd proved that the best solutions often come from the most unlikely sources, that desperation can drive innovation, that young people with knowledge are more valuable than old people with assumptions, that survival requires throwing out what doesn't work and building what does, regardless of whether it looks like what everyone else is doing. The shelter that stayed 68 while outside temperature hit -30 wasn't a miracle. It was applied physics, synthesized knowledge, and the courage of a 16-year-old girl Horvist to let other people's expectations determine her fate. If that story means something to you, if you believe traditional knowledge and real problem-solving deserve to be documented and shared, subscribe to this channel. We're preserving techniques and stories that prove their worth when everything depended on them. That knowledge is worth keeping alive, and the people who developed it deserve to be remembered not as curiosities, but as engineers, innovators, and survivors who understood that wisdom comes from doing, not from being told what's proper. Inger Lindstrom built more than an underground shelter in 1873. She built proof that knowledge, courage, and the willingness to challenge assumptions can overcome almost any obstacle. The physics are still the same, the principles still work, and Theleson still matters. When everything is stripped away, what you know and what you're willing to do with that knowledge is all that stands between you and failure. That's worth remembering, that's worth sharing, and that's why these stories matter.